Teeth under the pillow. Lydia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small, white object in her hand. A child's tooth, barely larger than a fingernail, smooth and worn from years of use. Her daughter, Emma, had lost it earlier that day, her first baby tooth. The excitement in Emma's eyes had been contagious. She had insisted on placing it under her pillow, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the tooth fairy. As the moonlight streamed through the blinds, Lydia felt a twinge of discomfort. Something about the tooth unnerved her. Perhaps it was how easily it had fallen out, or the way Emma hadn't cried, not even when blood had stained her tiny lips. It was just part of growing up, Lydia told herself. She smiled, trying to shake the feeling as she gently tucked the tooth beneath Emma's pillow and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Good night, my love," she whispered, before turning off the lamp. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the wind outside. Lydia lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to claim her. Yet something felt off. A sense of wrongness clung to the air, like a presence lurking just beyond her field of vision. She glanced at the digital clock by her bedside, 2:13 a.m. Hours had passed, yet her mind wouldn't rest. A faint noise broke the silence, barely perceptible, but enough to make her sit up. It was coming from Emma's room. Lydia's heart quickened. At first, she thought Emma was tossing and turning, but the noise continued, an odd, scraping sound, like fingernails scratching across a wooden surface. She pushed aside the covers and tiptoed down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under her weight. As she approached Emma's door, the noise stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. Lydia hesitated before pushing the door open a crack. Emma lay in bed, her chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. The moonlight cast long shadows across the room, giving the toys and furniture a sinister, distorted look. Lydia exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for worrying. Just as she turned to leave, something on the floor caught her eye. A tooth. It was sitting in the middle of the rug, gleaming in the moonlight. Confused, Lydia knelt down to pick it up. It looked like the same tooth she had placed under Emma's pillow earlier. Maybe Emma had knocked it out while she slept, but when Lydia glanced at the bed, she noticed a small lump beneath the pillow. She carefully lifted it, revealing the tooth still in its place. Her blood turned cold. Slowly, she unfolded her fingers and stared at the tooth she had just picked up. 2 teeth. Why were there 2? A creeping dread gripped her stomach. She looked down at Emma, who was still sound asleep, completely unaware. Lydia backed out of the room, closing the door gently, but her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe Emma had lost 2 teeth and they had fallen out without her realizing it. Lydia tried to convince herself, but the unease gnawed at her as she returned to her bed. The night stretched on, thick with tension. Lydia barely slept, plagued by unsettling dreams and the sensation of being watched. When morning finally came, she was relieved to hear the sound of Emma's voice, chattering happily about the tooth fairy. Lydia made her way to the kitchen, pouring herself a strong cup of coffee to shake off the lingering exhaustion. As she sat at the table, Emma ran up to her, clutching something in her small hand. "Mommy, look! Another one!" Lydia froze. Emma held out her hand, and in her palm was another tooth. It was just as small and white as the others, but this time Lydia noticed something odd. The edges of the tooth were jagged, almost sharp, and the surface was cracked in places. It didn't look like a child's tooth. "Where did you find this, sweetie?" Lydia asked, her voice tight. Emma shrugged. "It was under my pillow. The tooth fairy left me 2 teeth last night." Lydia's heart raced. She tried to smile, but her mind was spinning. "Maybe we should, put these in a safe place," she said, guiding Emma to the living room. As her daughter played with her toys, Lydia stood in the hallway, staring at the small collection of teeth. Something wasn't right. That night, Lydia decided to stay up. She sat in the living room, her eyes on the clock, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The hours ticked by, and as the house fell into deep silence once more, Lydia heard it again. The scraping. It was louder this time, more deliberate. She grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept back to Emma's room. The noise grew louder as she approached. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pushed the door open. Emma was asleep, but something else was in the room. At the foot of the bed stood a shadowy figure, hunched over Emma's pillow. Its long, bony fingers scraped the wood of the bed frame as it reached beneath the pillow, pulling out another tooth. Lydia gasped, and the figure turned its head toward her. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human's, with hollow eye sockets and a wide, lipless grin. Teeth, hundreds of them, filled its gaping mouth, jagged and mismatched, like they had been crudely shoved into place. The creature hissed, its head jerking unnaturally as it stepped toward her. Lydia stumbled back, her body frozen in fear. The figure reached out, its fingers twitching, but then it stopped. Slowly, it retreated into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Lydia rushed to Emma's side, pulling her into her arms. She checked the pillow, another tooth. This one was cracked and blackened like it had been rotting for years. The next morning, Lydia packed their bags and left the house without looking back. As they drove away, Emma turned to her mother, her innocent voice breaking the silence. "Mommy," she said, "why did the tooth fairy leave me someone else's teeth?" Lydia didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing for certain. Those teeth weren't hers.
Story number 2.
Voices without mouth. It was the middle of winter when Sarah inherited the old family cabin nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. She hadn't visited the place since she was a child, but after her mother passed away, it was left to her. The cabin had been in the family for generations, isolated from the world, and used mostly for short getaways. But Sarah, now seeking an escape from her hectic life, decided to take a week off and retreat there for some peace and quiet. The first few days were blissful. The cold air, the smell of pine, and the distant sounds of wildlife made it the perfect place to relax. But by the third night, Sarah started hearing something strange. It began as a faint murmur, almost like the wind, but not quite. At first, she dismissed it, assuming it was the creaking of the old wooden house or animals scurrying through the trees. But the sound persisted. As she sat reading by the fire, she became increasingly aware of soft, indecipherable whispers that seemed to float through the walls of the cabin. One night, she woke abruptly, heart pounding. It was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying fire in the living room. Her ears pricked up as she heard the whispering again, clearer this time. It wasn't just noise, it was voices. She sat up, straining to listen, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices were close but distant at the same time, like they were inside her head. Shivering, she grabbed her phone, checking for any signal. Nothing. The isolation of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. The next morning, Sarah tried to rationalize the sounds. Maybe it was an auditory illusion, the result of the cabin's old pipes or the wind creating strange echoes. She went outside to clear her head and get some fresh air, but the oppressive quiet of the forest seemed even more eerie now. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods. The trees loomed high, their branches bare and twisted, as though they were reaching for her. As she walked around, her unease deepened. There was a weight to the air, a stillness that made her feel watched. Later that evening, as she was cooking dinner, she heard the voices again. This time, they were louder, more insistent. She froze, the spoon in her hand clattering to the floor. The whispering seemed to come from the walls themselves, like they were alive and speaking to her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer, just more whispers. Unable to bear it any longer, she grabbed a flashlight and began searching the cabin. She checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. No sign of intruders, no hidden speakers, nothing that could explain the voices. Her only company was the oppressive quiet of the cabin and the eerie sensation of being surrounded by unseen watchers. That night, Sarah barricaded herself in the bedroom. Sleep eluded her as the voices persisted, whispering, growing louder. And now she could understand some of the words. Help. Us. Find us. Her heart raced as the disembodied voices filled the room. They sounded desperate, like they were trying to tell her something. She covered her ears, but it didn't stop the whispers. As dawn broke, Sarah knew she couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. She packed her things, determined to leave, but something held her back. The voices, though terrifying, were also pleading. Against her better judgment, she decided to stay one more night. Just one more. That evening, she sat in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames. The whispering had become constant, like a chorus of unseen voices swirling around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to lead her somewhere. And then, just as she was about to retreat to bed, one voice stood out from the rest. It was clearer, more distinct. Under the floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She glanced down at the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. Trembling, she grabbed a crowbar from the shed outside and returned to the cabin. She knelt by the fireplace, prying up the floorboards one by one. Her hands shook as she worked, the voices growing louder with each nail she removed. Finally, she uncovered a small, hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dusty box. Her heart pounded as she opened it, revealing a collection of yellowed papers, photographs, and something else, something wrapped in a rag. Carefully, she unwrapped it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a small human skull, no larger than that of a child. She recoiled in horror, the weight of what she'd found sinking in. The whispers were deafening now, filling the room like a rising storm. The photographs showed a family, her ancestors, standing outside the cabin. In one of the pictures, a little girl stood apart from the rest, her face solemn, her eyes vacant. Sarah's hands shook as she read the notes scrawled on the papers. They detailed the tragic story of a child who had gone missing from the family long ago. They had searched, but she had never been found. Until now. Sarah's blood ran cold. The child's remains had been hidden beneath the floor for decades, her spirit trapped, unable to rest. The voices had been her cries for help all this time. As Sarah knelt over the remains, a wave of sorrow washed over her. She felt the presence in the room shift, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. The whispering softened, as if the voices were finally at peace. But just as Sarah began to feel relief, she heard one final voice, clearer, closer than ever. It wasn't the child. It was a different voice, deep and menacing. You shouldn't have opened the box. Before she could react, the floor beneath her buckled, and the whispers surged back, louder and more malicious than ever, enveloping her completely. Sarah screamed, but no one was there to hear her. The voices had mouths now, and they were hungry.
Story number 3.
Forgotten Twin Returns. It was a late September evening, and the heavy rain fell like an ominous whisper on the roof of the old house. Rachel stood in the dimly lit hallway of her childhood home, clutching a tattered letter she'd found in a box in the attic earlier that day. It wasn't addressed to her, but to a name she hadn't heard in over 20 years. Rebecca, her twin sister. Rebecca had been her other half, the mirror image of herself, until the day she vanished without a trace when they were only 6. The disappearance had shattered their family, spiraling her parents into a lifelong depression. The search had been exhaustive, police combing through nearby woods and neighbors, but Rebecca had simply disappeared. Rachel had grown up in the shadow of her absence, always feeling like half of her was missing. Now, standing in the same house where memories of laughter and shared secrets once filled the air, Rachel's hands shook as she read the letter aloud. I am coming home, Rachel. You can't forget me forever. We will be together again soon, just like before. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Rebecca's. Rachel recognized it from their childhood diaries, written before her sister vanished. But how was this possible? Rebecca hadn't been seen or heard from since that fateful day. Rachel looked around the house, half convinced that she'd see her twin standing in the corner, but all she saw were shadows playing tricks on her in the dim light. The house felt alive in ways she hadn't noticed before. Old wooden floorboards creaked under her feet. The walls seemed to breathe, and the constant hum of the wind outside sounded like whispers calling her name. It was like the house remembered things she couldn't. Unable to shake the unease, Rachel decided to stay in the house overnight. She hadn't done so in years, but with both her parents gone, there was no one left to stop her. She needed answers, and it seemed that the house itself held the key. As night fell, Rachel settled into her old room, the one she'd once shared with Rebecca. Everything had been preserved as if her parents expected Rebecca to return one day. The twin beds, side by side, stared at each other across the room, still draped in the same floral bedspreads from decades ago. Rachel lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the letter was some kind of cruel prank. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that her sister was closer than she realized. Around midnight, the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the hallway. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The sound wasn't just a creak of the house. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone was walking toward her door. The footsteps stopped just outside her room. "Rebecca?" she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. The doorknob slowly twisted, and the door creaked open, revealing nothing but the dark, empty hallway. A rush of cold air swept into the room, making the hair on the back of Rachel's neck stand up. She sat up in bed, her pulse racing, her eyes darting around the room, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. Just as she was about to convince herself it was her imagination, she heard it. A soft giggle, a sound that was eerily familiar, Rebecca's laugh. "Rach?" The whisper came from the bed opposite hers. She looked across the room, her heart hammering in her chest, and saw the indentation of a body on Rebecca's bed as though someone were lying there. "Rebecca?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was a long pause before the whisper returned. "You forgot me. You left me behind." "I didn't," Rachel choked out, tears welling in her eyes. "You disappeared. We searched for you. I didn't forget you. I could never forget you." The whisper turned colder, angrier. "You tried to replace me." Rachel's mind raced back to her childhood, to the months after Rebecca's disappearance. She'd been sent to therapy, encouraged to move on, to make new friends, but she had never replaced Rebecca. She could never. The room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. The presence in the room was palpable, and Rachel felt her twin's anger as if it were her own. "I didn't replace you," she said, her voice trembling. "I missed you every day. I'm still missing you." The giggle returned, but this time it was more sinister, twisted with malice. "You don't remember what happened, do you?" Rachel's mind spun. The night of Rebecca's disappearance was a blur. She'd blocked out most of it, a defense mechanism to cope with the trauma. But now, in the suffocating darkness of the room, memories began to trickle back, bits and pieces of a night she had long tried to forget. A flash of them playing near the river, the cold water, Rebecca screaming, and then silence. Rachel gasped as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She hadn't lost Rebecca. Rebecca hadn't been taken. She had drowned in the river, and Rachel had watched it happen. She had buried the memory so deeply, she had convinced herself Rebecca had vanished. "You let me drown," the voice hissed. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as the truth unraveled before her. The guilt, the forgotten memories, it all came crashing down. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." But it was too late. The air in the room thickened, the weight of her forgotten twin's anger pressing down on her. The indentation on Rebecca's bed deepened as though someone was rising from it. "I'm back now," Rebecca whispered, her voice cold and vengeful, "and I'm never leaving you again." Rachel screamed as the shadows in the room enveloped her, the guilt of her forgotten twin pulling her into the dark, where the two sisters would be together once more, just like Rebecca had promised. Forever.
Story number 4.
No heartbeat inside. The night was quiet, save for the soft hum of the wind weaving through the dense trees that lined the narrow road. A soft drizzle tapped against the windshield as Claire drove toward the old family house she hadn't visited in years. It sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods that felt as ancient as time itself. Her grandmother, who had passed away a week ago, had left the house to her in the will, but Claire had avoided coming for as long as she could. There were too many memories, too many whispers of things she didn't want to face. As the headlights of her car swept across the driveway, the house loomed into view, standing tall and eerie against the stormy sky. It was an old Victorian structure, its walls weathered and windows dark like hollow eyes staring back at her. Claire parked the car and stepped out, pulling her jacket tighter around her as the cold bit into her skin. She walked up the creaky steps to the front door, a sense of dread curling in her stomach. The key turned in the lock with a rusty click, and the door groaned open, revealing the dark interior. The house smelled of dust and old wood. It hadn't been lived in for years, not since her grandmother had been moved to a care home. Claire flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, the power was out. She pulled out her phone and used the flashlight to navigate through the hallways. The old pictures still hung on the walls, faded and crooked, their subjects long dead. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something in those photos was watching her, following her movements. Her plan was simple: spend the night, pack a few of her grandmother's things in the morning, and leave. She wouldn't stay longer than necessary. As she moved through the house, memories came flooding back, memories of her childhood summers spent here. Her grandmother had always warned her to stay out of the basement. "There are things down there you don't want to see," she would say, her voice dropping to a low, ominous tone that always left Claire chilled. As a child, she'd never dared to disobey. But now, curiosity gnawed at her. The door to the basement was still there, at the end of the hall, its paint peeling and the wood beneath splintered. Claire stood before it, the light from her phone casting long shadows across the floor. She hesitated, remembering her grandmother's warnings, but then shook her head. There was nothing to be afraid of. Her grandmother was gone. Whatever secrets the basement held were long buried. The door creaked open, revealing a set of wooden stairs that descended into darkness. The air that drifted up was damp and cold, carrying with it the scent of earth and mold. Claire took a deep breath and started down, each step creaking under her weight. When she reached the bottom, her flashlight revealed a large, cluttered room filled with old furniture, boxes, and, oddly enough, dozens of jars. They lined the shelves, filled with strange, murky liquids, floating objects barely visible in the dark. She felt her skin crawl as she moved closer to inspect them. Her breath caught in her throat. The jars held small, misshapen lumps of flesh. Hearts, all of them. Human hearts. Some were shriveled and blackened, others disturbingly fresh, still red and glistening under the dim light. Panic surged through her. What kind of dark rituals had her grandmother been involved in? What had she been doing down here? Just as she was about to turn and flee, something caught her eye. A single, large jar in the center of the shelf. Unlike the others, it was empty, no liquid, no heart, just an inscription on the glass that read, "Claire." Her blood ran cold. A soft thumping sound echoed through the room, slow and steady. At first, she thought it was her own heartbeat, but then she realized it wasn't coming from inside her chest. The sound was coming from behind her. Claire whipped around, her flashlight shaking in her hands. The far wall of the basement was lined with small wooden doors, each one resembling a tiny cupboard. One of them was slightly ajar, and from inside came that soft, rhythmic thumping. Against her better judgment, she walked toward it, every step feeling like a mistake. The door creaked as she pulled it open, revealing a small, dark compartment. Inside, something pulsed. It was a heart, her heart, beating in the darkness, still connected to something she couldn't see. Her phone slipped from her hands, the light flickering as it hit the ground. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest. Her heartbeat, it was gone. She couldn't feel it. There was no thumping, no rhythm inside her chest anymore. Panic gripped her as she tried to breathe, her body cold and numb. She fell to the ground, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her chest, feeling nothing but empty space beneath her ribs. The heart in the cupboard continued to beat. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut upstairs, and Claire heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen, paralyzed by the horrifying realization that she had no heartbeat inside her anymore. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, Claire's grandmother. But it couldn't be. She was dead. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes dark, her smile wicked. "I told you," the woman said softly, her voice sending chills down Claire's spine. "You shouldn't have come down here." The woman reached for the jar with Claire's name on it, her fingers tracing the glass. "This heart of yours, wait," she whispered. "It's not yours anymore. It belongs to the house now." With a final sinister smile, the woman closed the cupboard door, silencing the last sound of Claire's heartbeat forever. The end.
Story number 5.
The Walls Weep. Anna had never seen the house before, not in any of the countless hours she spent searching for a new place to live. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, tucked away on a quiet, overgrown street that had long been forgotten. The listing, oddly enough, was too perfect to be real. Spacious rooms, cheap rent, and close to work. Despite a deep unease settling into her stomach, she clicked "Contact Agent" and scheduled a visit. The house was more imposing in person, its gray stone walls climbing high, pressing against the narrow street. Its windows were tall and narrow, as if trying to keep secrets behind their thick glass. The front door creaked open the moment Anna touched the handle, as though the house had been expecting her. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and dampness. "This place hasn't been lived in for years," said the realtor, a thin, pale woman with a nervous energy. She gestured to the high ceilings and crown molding, her voice trembling slightly. "A gem like this, well, it's a steal." Anna wasn't sure if she liked the house or if the house liked her. There was something alive about it. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she explored the large, empty rooms. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each gust of wind that found its way through the cracks. But the unease melted into fascination. Despite the coldness that clung to her skin, she felt drawn to the place. It was as if the house wanted her there, as if she belonged. "Is it true what they say?" Anna asked, surprising herself. The question had bubbled up from some deep part of her mind, a whisper she hadn't realized was there. The realtor froze, her eyes narrowing. "What do they say?" "About the weeping," Anna replied, her voice almost a whisper now, "that the walls weep." The woman's face tightened. "Old houses make noises," she said flatly, "but no, the walls don't weep." She forced a smile. "Are you interested?" Anna nodded. She wasn't sure why, but yes, she was interested. The house had her now. The first night was uneventful, if not unsettling. Anna unpacked a few boxes, set up a small lamp, and collapsed into bed. The silence was oppressive, filling her ears like static. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, but exhaustion won over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. She woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, with the sensation that someone or something was in the room with her. She lay still, listening, her breath caught in her throat. The wind howled outside, and the floorboards moaned beneath invisible feet. And then she heard it, a soft, wet sound, a slow, rhythmic dripping. Anna sat up, her heart thudding against her ribs. The sound was coming from the wall beside her bed. She reached out and touched the cold stone, feeling the faint vibrations of moisture seeping through. The walls were weeping. Her fingers came away wet. A clear liquid, thick and viscous, coated her skin. She recoiled, wiping her hand on the sheets, her pulse quickening. The next morning, she inspected the wall, but there were no signs of water damage, no visible cracks, just the smooth, cold stone. She convinced herself it was her imagination, a trick played by her tired mind. But the dripping returned the next night, more persistent, more deliberate. The sound echoed in the dark, wrapping around her like a second skin. When she touched the wall this time, the liquid was darker, sticky, almost like blood. Her unease grew into fear, but she couldn't leave. Something held her there, tethered to the house. Days passed in a haze, the weeping walls becoming a sinister lullaby that haunted her every night. She began to hear whispers, too, soft voices calling her name from the deepest corners of the house. Sometimes she thought she saw shapes moving in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. One night, desperate for answers, Anna wandered down into the basement. It was damp, the air thick with rot. In the center of the room stood a stone well, its edges crumbling with age. A chill ran down her spine as she approached it. The dripping sound was louder now, echoing up from the well's depths. She peered inside but could see nothing, only an endless black void. That was when she noticed the marks on the walls of the basement, scratches, long and jagged, as if someone had clawed at the stone. Her breath hitched as she realized the scratches formed words, a message etched into the very bones of the house. "Help me, they're inside the walls." Anna stumbled back, her heart racing. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing impossibly thick. She ran up the stairs, but the house felt different now, angrier. The whispers had turned to screams, shrieking from the very walls that bled and wept. She could hear them clawing, something or someone trapped inside. In a panic, Anna grabbed her phone, dialing the realtor's number. It rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered, calm and collected. "Hello, Anna?" "Something's wrong," Anna gasped, barely able to form the words. "The walls, there's something." The voice on the other end cut her off. "You need to calm down." Anna froze. The voice wasn't the realtor's anymore. It was cold, distant, and dripping with malice. "You won't leave, Anna," it whispered. "You're part of the house now." She dropped the phone and ran to the door, only to find it wouldn't budge. The house groaned around her, the walls closing in, dripping that thick red liquid. And then she saw them, hands pressing against the walls, stretching the stone like skin. Faces, contorted in agony, emerged, their mouths open in silent screams. The walls weren't just weeping, they were alive. Anna backed away, her mind racing. The weeping was louder now, echoing in her skull. And then she realized the truth. The house didn't want her to leave. It wanted to consume her. And the twist came crashing into her. The walls weren't just haunted by spirits. They were the spirits. Every tenant who had come before her, every soul that had once lived within the house's cursed walls, was trapped, bound to the stone. She too was becoming one with them, and now as the walls closed in around her, she knew soon she would weep as well.
Story number 6.
Smile in darkness. The wind howled through the empty streets as Claire walked home, clutching her coat tightly around her body. The night felt colder than usual, as if the darkness itself had weight. She glanced at the dilapidated buildings lining the road, their windows empty, their facades crumbling like forgotten relics of the past. There was something unnerving about this part of town, something that had always kept Claire away from it after dark. But tonight, she had no choice. Her car had broken down a few blocks away and her phone had run out of battery. She had debated waiting for someone to pass by, but the streets had been deserted for hours. Now, with no other option, she found herself walking alone through the eerie silence of the abandoned neighborhood. The only sound that accompanied her footsteps was the steady tap of her boots on the cracked pavement. Yet something felt off. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every few steps, Claire stopped, looking over her shoulder, scanning the shadows that seemed to cling to every corner. Nothing. Just darkness. But there was a feeling, an unmistakable sensation that someone or something was nearby. She quickened her pace, trying to push away the growing unease. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than the wind that whipped through the alleyways. As she approached a flickering streetlight, a sudden chill ran down her spine. In the corner of her eye, just beyond the edge of the light's reach, she thought she saw a figure, a man, standing still, watching her. Claire turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat, but the figure was gone. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was her mind playing tricks, a trick of the shadows. She continued forward, her eyes darting back and forth, straining to see through the blackness. And then she saw it again, just a brief glimpse this time of something or someone standing in the darkness, watching her. Claire called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. She swallowed hard, feeling a tight knot forming in her stomach. Her mind raced with thoughts, stories she'd heard about this part of town, about people disappearing, never to be seen again. She quickened her steps, the streetlights now fewer and farther apart, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Claire's pulse quickened as she saw her destination, a dimly lit street that would lead her to a busier part of the city. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Behind her, there was a sound, a low, rumbling growl. She froze, every muscle in her body tense. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes searching the darkness, but all she saw was an endless void. The growl echoed again, louder this time, closer. Her heart raced as she scanned the area, desperately looking for the source of the sound. But then, she saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes staring at her from the shadows. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, fixed on those eyes. Then, slowly, they moved, closer and closer. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps now, dragging across the ground, coming toward her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice shaking. No response. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, it seemed like a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in tattered clothes. But as it stepped into the faint light of a nearby lamp, its face, it wasn't human. It was twisted, distorted, as if something had torn it apart and stitched it back together with jagged pieces of flesh. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, wide and grotesque, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. And its eyes, those yellow, glowing eyes, they were locked onto her. Claire screamed and turned, running as fast as she could down the street. Her legs pumped furiously, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But she could hear it behind her, its footsteps growing louder, faster. She didn't dare look back. She spotted a small alleyway and darted into it, hoping to lose the creature in the maze of buildings. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted through the narrow passage, the walls closing in on her. She could hear the creature behind her, the growl growing louder, more feral. Suddenly, she reached a dead end, Claire's heart sank. She spun around, her back pressed against the cold brick wall, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the creature slowly emerge from the shadows. It moved with an unnatural grace, its twisted face still locked in that horrifying grin. She looked around desperately for an escape, but there was none. The creature was only a few feet away now, its grin widening impossibly, revealing more of its jagged teeth. Claire could smell its foul breath, a mix of rot and decay. Tears streamed down her face as she braced for the inevitable. But then, just as the creature was about to pounce, it stopped, its head tilted to the side as if listening to something. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the creature suddenly stepped back, its eyes narrowing. And then, without warning, it disappeared into the darkness. Claire stood there, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she heard it. A soft, eerie whisper coming from the darkness. "You're safe. For now." Claire's legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground, her mind reeling. What had just happened? Why had the creature spared her? As she sat there, trying to calm her racing heart, something caught her eye, a reflection in a broken window nearby. Her blood turned to ice. In the window, staring back at her, was her own reflection, but with one horrifying difference. She was smiling. A wide, twisted smile, just like the creature's. The darkness, it seemed, had left its mark.
Story number 7.
Eyes inside walls. It was an unassuming, weather-beaten house at the end of the road. No one in the small town of Eldridge paid much attention to it anymore. The last occupant had been an elderly woman, Miss Agnes, who had passed away quietly in her sleep years ago. After that, the house just sat there, its windows like blank eyes staring out at the world, forgotten by most, except for Heather and David. Heather had always been fascinated by abandoned places. She loved the way old houses seemed to hold memories, the walls brimming with untold stories. David, her boyfriend, didn't share her passion, but he humored her. So when Heather suggested they explore the old house on the edge of town, he reluctantly agreed. "We'll just take a quick look inside," Heather promised, her eyes gleaming with excitement as they stood outside the rusted iron gate. "Just for fun." David sighed but followed her up the creaking steps. The air around the house felt thick, almost as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The door was unlocked, and with a slow, hesitant push, Heather opened it. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and cobwebs hung like drapes from the corners of the ceiling. "It's just an old house, nothing scary about it," David muttered as he kicked a loose floorboard. But Heather wasn't listening. She was already wandering deeper into the house, her eyes wide with curiosity. As she moved through the dimly lit hallway, she felt a strange sensation, as though the house were watching her. She brushed it off, thinking it was just her overactive imagination. They explored room after room, each one more decayed than the last. The wallpaper was peeling and cracks snaked through the ceiling. Yet something about the place unsettled David. It felt as though the house were alive, breathing. Every now and then he swore he heard soft creaking noises, as if someone or something was moving just behind the walls. Heather, however, was enamored with the mystery of it all. She found an old photo album on a dusty shelf and sat down to look through it. "Look, David," she called, flipping through the faded photographs. "This must have been Miss Agnes when she was young, and this must be her family." David wandered over and glanced at the pictures. The family looked ordinary enough, smiling faces and stiff clothing, but something about the photographs unnerved him. The eyes of every person in the photo seemed too focused, too intense, as if they were aware of being watched. "Creepy," David muttered. He turned away from the album, his gaze drifting toward the walls. That's when he noticed something strange. "Hey, Heather, come here." Heather joined him, looking at the spot on the wall where David was pointing. The wallpaper, yellowed and cracked, had a slight bulge in it, like something was pushing out from behind it. David pressed his ear to the wall. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Heather listened. At first, she heard nothing, just the silence of the old house. But then, faintly, she picked up on a soft, rhythmic sound, a faint shuffling, like feet dragging across the floor, but muffled as if it was coming from within the walls. "That's weird," she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Probably just mice or something." But David wasn't so sure. His gut twisted with unease. Without a word, he grabbed a nearby chair and dragged it to the wall. Climbing onto it, he began peeling away at the wallpaper, exposing the bare wooden boards underneath. "Heather, help me." Reluctantly, she joined him, tearing away the layers until they revealed a small, rectangular hatch built into the wall. It was sealed shut, but the wood looked old and rotted. David, ignoring Heather's hesitant protests, pried it open with a sharp crack. Behind the wall was a narrow, dark passage, barely big enough for someone to crawl through. The air that rushed out was cold, damp, and carried a faint, rancid smell. "I don't like this," Heather whispered, taking a step back. David shined his flashlight into the passage. The beam revealed something odd. The walls of the passage were covered in deep gouges, like something had scratched at them over and over. And then they saw it, far at the end of the passage, something glimmered faintly in the light. "Is that?" David squinted. Eyes. 2 eyes, unblinking, glowing faintly in the darkness. Heather screamed, stumbling back as the light flickered. David tried to focus the beam again, but the eyes were gone. In their place, a faint, soft, shuffling sound echoed down the passage, coming closer. "We need to go," Heather shouted, grabbing David's arm. They turned to run, but the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound of nails scratching, slow and deliberate, began to echo through the room, coming from all around them, from within the walls. Panic set in as the walls seemed to come alive. There were more eyes now, dozens of them, peering out from the cracks and gaps in the walls, watching them. Heather backed into a corner, her breath shallow as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. David, his heart racing, tried to force open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The eyes, all of them, disappeared, vanishing into the cracks. "I don't," David began, but before he could finish, the floor beneath him creaked violently, giving way. He screamed as he fell through the floorboards into darkness. Heather ran to the hole, but there was nothing, no sign of David, just an empty, black void. Then, from the depths below, a voice whispered, soft but clear, "Help me. They're watching." Heather froze, her heart pounding. The voice was David's, but it was distant, distorted, as if coming from behind the walls. Slowly, she looked up, and there, staring at her from the walls, were the eyes again. Only this time, she recognized them. They were David's. In Eldridge, the house still stands, its windows blank and empty. But if you listen closely, sometimes you can hear it. The soft scratching of nails and the faint, pleading whisper of a voice trapped forever behind the walls.
Story number 8.
Voice in the Pillow. The soft hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in Emma's apartment that night. She had just moved in, unpacking the last of her boxes that evening. Tired, she collapsed onto her bed, the faint scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. The place felt empty, a little too quiet, but she liked that. It was her own space now, free from the suffocating clamor of her previous life. She turned off the bedside lamp and buried her face in her pillow. It was one of the few things she'd brought with her from her old apartment, something familiar in a new place, but as her head sank into the soft cushion, she froze. A voice. Muffled, distant, barely a whisper, but there, unmistakable. It came from beneath her ear, inside the pillow. "Emma." Her heart skipped a beat. She bolted upright, her breath coming in short gasps. She told herself she was imagining things. Exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. She sat still for a moment, listening to the hum of the fan, to the nothingness of the room. Nothing. All was quiet. With a deep breath, she lowered herself back onto the pillow. "Emma?" This time it was clearer. Closer. Her heart pounded and she yanked the pillow away, throwing it across the room. What the hell was happening? She stood, staring at the pillow as though it might slither back toward her. For minutes she waited, but nothing else happened. Eventually she laughed nervously. "I'm losing it," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. "It's just stress." She picked the pillow up cautiously. It felt normal, soft, filled with feathers like any pillow. She shook it a bit and put it back on the bed. Slowly, she laid down again. At first, silence. Then, faintly, "Help me." Emma shot up, heart racing. She threw the pillow aside again and rushed to the light switch. The room flooded with harsh light, chasing away the shadows. Her eyes darted around, scanning every corner, but there was nothing there, just her bed, her unpacked boxes, and that pillow lying still on the floor. She picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Claire. "It's late, Emma. What's going on?" Claire's voice was groggy, tinged with irritation. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think my pillow is talking. Talking. Talking?" "Yes." Emma's voice trembled. "I hear a voice inside it. It says my name. It says help me. I don't know what to do." Claire sighed. "Emma, you've been stressed out for weeks. New apartment, new job. You're probably just hearing things. It's your nerves." "But it's real. It's late. Go to sleep. Call me tomorrow, okay?" Emma wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was too heavy. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. She hung up, turning the light off once more, and hesitantly climbed back into bed. She stared at the ceiling, her breath shallow, afraid to even look at the pillow. Minutes passed, an hour, maybe more. She began to drift into a fragile sleep when the voice came again, this time clearer than before. "Emma, I need you." Her eyes shot open. "Please, you have to help me." Emma sat up, her skin cold with fear. It wasn't her imagination. Someone or something was in her pillow. Slowly, she reached for it. Her hands shook as she pressed her ear to the fabric. "Trapped. I'm trapped in here." The voice was faint, filled with desperation. Emma's hands trembled. She wanted to scream, to run, but something kept her frozen in place. "Who are you?" she whispered, barely audible. The voice paused, then responded, almost like a sigh. "I'm in the feathers, trapped in the down." Emma's mind raced. Trapped in the feathers? The absurdity of it should have made her laugh, but instead a deep sense of dread settled over her. "How can I help?" she asked, her voice fragile. "I was someone once," the voice replied, cracking slightly. "But now I'm here. If you destroy it, I can be free." Destroy the pillow? It seemed simple enough, but something about it unnerved her. She wanted to help, anything to make the voice go away, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. She hesitated, clutching the pillow tight in her hands. "How did you get in here?" There was a long silence. Then the voice responded, lower, darker this time. "They put me here, in the feathers. My soul is bound, and now I'm stuck." Emma's blood ran cold. Bound? By who? She stood abruptly, throwing the pillow back down. She couldn't stay here, not with that thing. The hallway lights flickered as she rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a knife. Whatever this was, she was going to end it. She returned to the room, knife in hand. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. The pillow lay innocently on the bed, as though it hadn't just spoken to her. But she knew she wasn't going crazy. She had to destroy it. With a deep breath, she plunged the knife into the pillow. A sharp cry echoed through the room as feathers burst out, swirling in the air like snow. Emma stumbled back, watching as the feathers floated gently to the floor. The room grew still. It was over. The voice was gone. Or so she thought. As she stood there, staring at the shredded pillow, a new sound filled the room. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, coming not from the pillow but from the walls. "Emma!" Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't in the pillow anymore. It was in the walls. It was everywhere. The walls began to creak, and the voice multiplied, overlapping into a chorus of whispers, all calling her name. Her throat tightened, and she backed away toward the door. Suddenly, the realization hit her like a wave of ice. She hadn't set the voice free. She had set it loose.
Story number 9.
Whispers from the Mirror. In the small, secluded town of Willow Creek, an antique shop sat wedged between two newer buildings, its dusty windows a stark contrast to the polished storefronts around it. The shop, Curio Cabinet, specialized in relics from forgotten times, and it was here that Lucy Parker stumbled upon the mirror. Lucy, in her mid-20s, had recently moved to Willow Creek after the unexpected death of her mother. She sought solitude, hoping the town's quiet atmosphere would provide her with a fresh start. She wandered into the Curio Cabinet one overcast afternoon, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The mirror caught her eye immediately. It was tall, framed in ornate gold, its surface slightly cloudy, as though it had seen too many years. "What's the story behind this one?" Lucy asked the shop owner, an elderly man who seemed to move slower than time itself. The man squinted at the mirror, his expression tight. "Ah, that one. Came from an old estate up the hill. Some say it's haunted. I've had it for years, but no one ever buys it." Lucy chuckled nervously. Haunted or not, the mirror had an eerie charm. "I'll take it." The old man hesitated for a moment but nodded, perhaps grateful to finally rid his shop of the unsettling object. That night, after placing the mirror in her bedroom, Lucy lay in bed, staring at it from across the room. Its reflective surface was almost hypnotic, catching the dim light from the street outside. She drifted off into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by a soft whispering sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she sat up in bed, she realized the whispers were coming from the mirror. Lucy? Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was whispering her name. She stared at the mirror, heart pounding, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The cloudy glass reflected her dimly lit room, her bed, the curtains swaying slightly in the breeze from the open window. She shook her head, convincing herself it had been a dream, and went back to sleep. The next night, the whispers returned. "Lucy, help us." This time the voice was louder, more distinct. Lucy bolted upright, her eyes fixed on the mirror. The surface seemed to ripple as though the glass were liquid. She gasped and turned on the bedside lamp, the sudden light chasing away the strange movement. For days, the whispers plagued her, growing louder each night. Sometimes they called her name. Other times, they spoke in hushed tones, too quiet for her to understand. Dark circles formed under her eyes as sleep became impossible. She considered removing the mirror, but found herself strangely attached to it. Every time she thought of getting rid of it, a strange dread filled her, as though something terrible would happen if she did. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, Lucy decided to confront the source of the whispers. She stood in front of the mirror, her reflection pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the mirror's surface began to fog over, not with steam, but as though something was pressing against it from the other side. A shape appeared, faint at first, but growing clearer by the second. It was a face, a woman's face, twisted in anguish, her eyes wide with terror. "Help us," the woman's voice echoed in Lucy's mind, though her lips in the mirror remained unmoving. Lucy stumbled backward, her heart racing. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the image of the woman shifted, and behind her, more faces emerged, dozens of them, their eyes hollow, their expressions pleading. They pressed against the glass, their whispers now a cacophony of voices begging for release. "Help us!" Lucy backed away until she hit the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. The mirror rippled again, the faces pressing closer as though they might break through the surface at any moment. "What are you?" Lucy cried out, her voice shaking. The woman's face became clearer, her features contorted in pain. "We're trapped," she whispered. Trapped in the mirror, bound by the one who owned it before. Lucy's mind raced. The old man at the shop had mentioned the estate on the hill. Could the previous owner have done this? Bound these souls to the mirror? "How do I help you?" Lucy asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's eyes locked onto hers. Lucy hesitated. She felt an overwhelming urge to smash the mirror, to free these tormented souls, but something deep within her screamed not to. What if this was a trick? "Break it," the woman repeated, her voice more insistent now. "Break the mirror, and we'll be free." Lucy grabbed a heavy book from her nightstand, her hands shaking. She raised it high, preparing to smash the glass. But just as she was about to bring it down, a new voice whispered from the mirror. "Don't!" The voice was soft, barely audible beneath the din of the other whispers, but it froze Lucy in place. "Don't break it," the voice continued, calm and steady. "They're lying." Lucy lowered the book, her eyes wide. "What? Who's lying?" "The ones in the mirror. They aren't trapped. They're imprisoned. For a reason." The faces in the mirror twisted in fury, their whispers rising in frantic desperation. "Break it!" they screamed. "Break it now!" The calm voice spoke again, quieter now but unmistakable. "If you break the mirror, they'll be free. But they're not victims, Lucy. They're monsters, and they want out." Lucy stared at the faces in the mirror, their once pleading expressions now warped with rage. The book slipped from her hands. With a sudden clarity, Lucy turned and fled from the room, slamming the door behind her. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more desperate, but she didn't stop. She ran out of the house and down the street, not stopping until she reached the curio cabinet. The old man was still there, sitting behind the counter as though waiting for her. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked softly. Lucy nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He sighed deeply. "That mirror, it holds them, but only just. Be glad you didn't break it, Lucy. Be very glad." The next morning, Lucy packed her things and left Willow Creek, leaving the mirror and its sinister whispers behind.
Story number 10.
Claire had always found comfort in the old house on Raven Hill, nestled just outside the town of Hemlock. It was a Victorian relic, passed down through generations in her family, its creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper brimming with memories of the past. She'd inherited it after her grandmother's death, and while it needed some repairs, Claire felt connected to its history. The house had always been a sanctuary, a place where she could disappear from the chaos of city life. However, in the past few weeks, things had changed. It began with subtle things, small enough to be dismissed. A door would be slightly ajar when she was sure she'd closed it. The old grandfather clock in the hallway had started chiming at odd hours, despite being broken for years. Yet Claire brushed it off as the quirks of an ancient house. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the house, Claire stood in the living room, admiring the tall, ornate curtains that framed the windows. They had always been one of her favorite features, velvety crimson, heavy with age. They added a sense of grandeur, as if the house were still clinging to its former glory. But tonight the curtains seemed oppressive, as if they were hiding something. She pulled them shut, shuddering at the cold draft that leaked in from the windows. The temperature had been dropping for days, even though it was midsummer. A sense of unease washed over her as she stepped back from the window, her eyes lingering on the fabric, half expecting it to move. The silence in the house felt louder than usual, broken only by the occasional groan of the old wooden beams. She turned on the television, hoping to drown out the stillness, but the static-filled screen only heightened her anxiety. Frustrated, she turned it off, deciding to read a book instead. An hour passed, and she became immersed in a mystery novel, her mind slowly calming. But then she heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable. Claire froze, her heart pounding. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the living room window, the one with the heavy crimson curtains. She strained her ears, listening intently. The rustling stopped. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself, trying to suppress the growing fear gnawing at her stomach. She stood up cautiously and crept toward the living room, her footsteps soft on the floor. The house felt colder now, as if the warmth had been sucked out of it. As she approached the window, the curtains seemed to loom larger, their rich fabric darker, almost as if they were swallowing the light. Another rustle. Claire's breath hitched. She reached out tentatively, her hand trembling as it hovered inches from the curtain. And then she saw it, a faint outline behind the fabric. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was subtle, just a hint of a shape, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was standing behind the curtains. Her first instinct was to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She forced herself to reach for the curtain, slowly pulling it back. Her hands shook violently as the fabric parted. Nothing. No one was there. She let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at her own paranoia. Of course, there was nothing. She was just scaring herself. She pulled the curtain completely open to prove it to herself. There was nothing but the dark night beyond the window. Still, the unease lingered, like a shadow creeping in the corners of her mind. Claire shut the curtains again and stepped away, but as she did, she caught something out of the corner of her eye, a quick, fleeting movement. Her breath hitched again, but when she turned to look, there was only the heavy fabric of the curtains, perfectly still. Trying to shake off her nerves, Claire decided to go to bed early. The house had a way of playing tricks on her, especially when she was tired. She climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. As she reached the top, she hesitated, glancing back down the hallway toward the living room. The curtains were just barely visible from her vantage point. She swore she saw the fabric twitch. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to continue upstairs. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Her eyes refused to stay closed, darting around the room, searching for movement in the shadows. Sleep felt impossible. Just as she began to drift off, a sound jolted her awake. Laughter. Low and sinister, barely audible, as if someone was standing just outside her door. Claire shot upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She listened intently, every muscle in her body tensed. The laughter came again, soft but unmistakable. It was followed by a faint rustling. She threw the covers off and grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand, clutching it tightly as she crept toward her bedroom door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She could hear the rustling again, louder now, as if it were coming from just down the hall. Claire flung the door open and shined her flashlight down the hallway. The curtains. They were drawn open. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't opened them. The wind couldn't have done it. Those curtains were far too heavy. Her breathing quickened as she slowly approached the living room. The air was icy now, her breath visible in front of her. The laughter returned, louder, echoing through the house. She reached the living room and aimed the flashlight at the window. Her heart nearly stopped. Behind the curtains, the faint outline of a figure was still there. Except now, it was clearer. She could see it. The silhouette of a person, its head tilted slightly, its mouth wide in a sinister grin. Claire stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from her hand. The grin grew wider, the figure unmoving, as if taunting her. She turned and ran, her mind racing with fear, desperate to escape. Just as she reached the front door, she froze. The curtains in front of her, every single window in the house, began to open. And behind every one of them, that same grin appeared, grinning from behind every curtain, waiting for her to come closer.